I'm Karl Garbrecht, and I'll be discussing modeling stress-strain curves for a material under simple tension given texture as a dependent variable. The modeling in this study was conducted using a machine learning technique called genetic programming-based symbolic regression, or just GPSR for short. The GPSR algorithm was implemented using an open source code package called Bingo. And I'd like to recognize the co-authors, Dr. Bomarito and Dr. Lesser, as the primary developers of that code package. The motivation for the study is that there's often a desire to use material data from a smaller heterogeneous scale, like the microstructure, in order to model material at a scale where a homogeneous approximation is appropriate, with the ultimate goal of modeling the mechanical response of an entire part or component. An important aspect or step in incorporating the heterogeneous microstructural properties of a material into a component scale model is finding a way to appropriately quantify them in a usable form. So take grain size as a property. It is a distribution of values which can be effectively homogenized by calculating the mean. In a similar fashion, texture can also be homogenized, but recognizing that it's a more complex property with a 3D nature, it also requires a more complex homogenization method. One such method of homogenization is the texture tensor presented by Kotha and Osterk. The texture tensor is essentially the weighted average of the z-axis orientation of a material specimen or sample. The weights are the grain size, and the eigenvectors of this tensor correspond to the intensity of the texture in 3 orthogonal directions, and those directions are given by the corresponding eigenvectors of the texture tensor. The eigenvectors also align with the material axis of symmetry for that specimen. Another alternative, which is one-dimensional, is the cosine similarity of a grain z-axis with respect to the direction of tension. This parameter doesn't necessarily contain any additional information that the texture tensor doesn't. However, the standard deviation of the cosine similarity, which is a description of the texture variability with respect to tension, isn't given relative to the variability of texture in any other directions. It's only with respect to, in this case, the direction of tension. This is just a scalar, and it doesn't capture certain 3D characteristics, and that may or may not be important depending on the nature of the problem under consideration. So now, with a way of homogenizing heterogeneous material properties, how can those be incorporated into a model? Well, one option is traditional regression methods, and another alternative is more contemporary machine learning techniques like genetic programming-based symbolic regression. The GPSR algorithm is based on a natural selection process in which the algorithm iteratively proposes, evaluates, and retains only the best solutions for the next iteration. Within the context of GPSR, a solution is an equation, and those are represented as directed acyclic graphs. Essentially, that provides a computer-readable hierarchical format that the algorithm can evaluate equations. Another critical aspect of representing equations or solutions in the form of graphs is that the required new proposal models within each subsequent generation needs to somehow combine aspects of the best solutions from the previous generation. And that can be done through a method called crossover, which is just random recombination of two graphs. So essentially mixing columns of two of these graphs or equations together. And then also new models are proposed through mutation, which consists of just changing single values or components of the graph, which results in changing components of an equation or solution. So through these recombination and mutation methods, the algorithm is able to explore the solution space while hopefully also converging toward the optimum solution or the optimum solutions. Some of the benefits or drivers for selecting GPSR rather than other machine learning techniques like decision trees or neural networks is that the result or output is a symbolic equation, which also hopefully can be easily interpreted and also more naturally incorporated into software or code packages. As a general reminder, the goal of this project was to develop a stress-strain model using texture. And we used EBSD data to gain insight into the microstructure of a material sample or specimen. Dream3D was used to process that data and provide grain size and texture of that specimen. The texture was given as a set of Euler angles, which corresponded to each grain. With that microscopy data and the mechanical test data, we were able to calibrate the viscoplastic self-consistent model developed by Los Alamos National Labs, and then propagate uncertainty forward in order to create training data for GPSR. That uncertainty propagation was accomplished by resampling texture from the original observed or experimental data set. And that way we were able to use VPSC to fairly rapidly produce hundreds of additional stress strain curves to be used as a training data set. And from that, the initial analysis produced the equation shown in the top left here, in which stress is given as a function of strain, a parameter describing texture alignment, and a parameter describing texture alignment variability. The first parameter alpha, corresponding to texture alignment, is from the eigenvectors of the texture tensor and describes how well the material texture aligns with the direction of tension. The parameter beta describes the variability of the alignment with respect to the direction of tension and was calculated from the cosine similarity parameter. The average error or average percent error was slightly less than 1% with testing data, and there was some variability with that error and trends associated with the error that was noticed as a function of the value of these texture parameters, most notably as they approached what was the max range of their values, the error did tend to increase. So some general comments regarding GPSR and these results. The algorithm produces many solutions or equations, and the final step of the process requires that the modeler select what is estimated to be the best equation or solution. This is typically done by comparing model complexity versus fitness to try to find a solution with the best balance. And also by evaluating those selected balanced solutions against a holdout or testing data set to estimate the expected generalization of those models. Also recognizing that the algorithm is selecting the best model based on a deterministic fitness within each evolutionary iteration. The algorithm can be prone to overfitting, especially with smaller data sets. So as an alternative model evaluation procedure, Bayesian statistics were proposed, and they offer an option for model selection in which the algorithm can use a probabilistic fitness function that is ideally inherently less prone to overfitting. So in the perfect scenario, this should result in all of the individuals within an entire population having very high generalizability, and that's carried out through the entire evolutionary process, even with small data sets. The Bayesian implementation of Bingo uses sequential Monte Carlo method to replace the deterministic fitness metric within the evaluation step. So instead of using a fitness error, which is just based on, or a fitness metric, which is just based on an error metric, the Bayesian reformulation would use a marginal likelihood, which is just the probability that a data set corresponds to the model being evaluated. And that can then be used to select the best model out of a given set. However, there is more to it than just swapping out two different fitness metrics. And in this case, the implementation of sequential Monte Carlo results in another iterative loop within the general GPSR loop, which is required in order to compute the marginal likelihood of each model for comparison. Within the context of SMC, model parameters are these fitted parameters. And from a high level, for each model, a set of model parameter values or particles is initialized based on a approximated prior distribution of those parameters for that model. Then each of those particles are evaluated with respect to the data and a likelihood function that's used to compute a weight for each particle. And then that set of particles is resampled to create another set, or the particles are filtered, and those filtered particles are mutated with a Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation. From there, the SMC loop repeats again. So again, on the top right was the solution found. Unfortunately, at least from my perspective, it was a quite complex solution and wasn't very interpretable. From the algorithm perspective, though, this model only has two fitted parameters. And so, at least from the algorithm's perspective, this wasn't that complex of a solution, at least compared to the deterministic solution in the prior example with 4 fitted parameters. The accuracy was an order of magnitude higher than the previous results, but this demonstration and the scale of analysis was much smaller than the previous one. It had a smaller population. It was run for fewer generational steps. And the goal was really just to evaluate the feasibility and to evaluate if the algorithm as implemented would converge. So from that perspective, the model did converge throughout the trial run, and it was good to be able to see that not only did it converge, it was predicting at least what it considered less complex solutions, and the solutions also generalized fairly well, which can be seen in the similarity between its performance or accuracy on a training data set and accuracy on a holdout or testing data set. So with the smaller trials that were conducted, there were some initial trends. Of course, they need to be further evaluated given the limited scope of this testing, but they suggest there may be better generalization with the sequential Monte Carlo implementation, especially with fewer generational steps. The table has some comparison SMC trial runs with associated deterministic GPSR trial runs. The ones in gray in rows 3 through 5 are runs that had similar hyperparameters like population generation using the same data set. The main conclusion from these is that the Bayesian implementation is definitely much slower than the deterministic formulation, where the deterministic implementation was able to complete this simulation or this trial run in 10 seconds or less. And the GPSR implementation with Bayesian fitness metrics took over an hour to complete. Another potential conclusion from this was that, or a potential observation from these tests, is that it did seem that the Bayesian implementation tended to converge faster with respect to the number of generational steps. But it definitely was not converging faster with respect to time. So it is a feasible alternative given the modeler has the time and computational resources available. The team is still working on improving the algorithm for efficiency and finalizing parallelization of the code. After that, we're excited to continue testing and evaluate what advantages the Bayesian bingo code has and what situations it would be best suited for. So with that, we definitely appreciate the efforts that went into data collection and the support from NASA, which makes this research possible. I hope you all enjoyed the material, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.